It's been incredible. It's only 5 weeks ago that the credit crunch turned into a mega crisis of the whole financial system. And in the interim, it's been amazing. We've had the most reactionary American government for 3/4 of a century carry out what in reality was the biggest act of nationalisation in human history. We then had the attempt to solve the crisis by the classic capitalist method of trying to escape from crisis, which is by allowing some capitalists to go bust in the hope that it help others. So they allowed Lehman Brothers to go bust. Rather than solving the crisis, it escalated the crisis with the dominoes knocking one another right over. And the effect of Lehman Brothers going bust is still not worked out in terms of the system, in terms of vast sums of derivatives held by various European banks and so forth. No one knows how much they're worth, whether anyone can pay them, and so on and so forth. But after that, they then moved to these huge bailouts, unimaginable sums. You can argue whether it's 750 billion or a trillion or 2 trillion, the American bailout, the British bailout, 400 billion, the German bailout, the French bailout, and so on and so forth. That's what we've been faced with. And we've been faced with in the midst of that. I mean, the only time in my life I can remember the Financial Times making you smile and laugh in the morning, because you had a ruling class at each other's throats with no sense of what to do. And the only comparison I can think of that is the period of the collapse of the USSR between 1989 and 1991, when our rulers argued in public, had no idea where to go, and had no idea where the thing was going to end up. Now, what's the origin of it? If I'd given this, I gave this talk in the little room here in June, and then at that time we talked about the credit crunch, the absurdity of these parcels of debt. You know, effectively the credit crunch was about people borrowing money in order to lend it to people who couldn't pay it back, and then getting bits of paper which they then passed from one another in a little parcel, past the parcel, hoping the music would never stop. And when the music stopped in August last year, they suddenly began their panic. But I don't want to go into that, because what for me is the parcel of subprime mortgages represented was the attempt basically of capitalism to get of the finance sector of capitalism to get profits out of nothing. It's a very good description, Karl Marx, about how under capitalism it seems that money will produce money. It's not true, of course. If you put a £10 note in the ground and leave it there, after a year, you'll still have a £10 note. I mean, if you put a £10 note and employ someone to do some work, then you can exploit them. If you really put a £1 note in the ground, it will not grow itself. But for the capitalists, it can seem like this, and therefore the idea the finance system can make money on its own account. Marx describes it brilliantly in Volume 3 of Capital, how easy this comes to. But we have to ask, how did this take hold? And here, the last speaker is right in this respect. Capitalism has been subject to this thing which Marx analysed, which sometimes seems very difficult to understand, and I don't intend to explain it fully now. But basically, as capitalism gets bigger, the level of investment grows, and as the level of investment grows, you need more and more profit to keep the rate of profit equal. It's rather as if you move from driving a small car, a Mini, to driving a Jaguar. It's no good having the same amount of petrol, you need more petrol. As you move from one stage of capitalism to a higher stage, you need more and more profit. The profit grows, but it doesn't grow fast enough. And since profit is the motivation for investment under capitalism, it's the source of new investment, that creates problems in the system. Problems in the system, for periods of capitalist history, have been disguised and covered as countervailing factors. But what I would say is absolutely clear, since all sorts of statisticians measuring the rate of profit in the mid-1970s came to the conclusion it started falling 4 or 5 years earlier. And it continued falling until 1982. Since then there have been partial recoveries of the rate of profit, but it's never recovered more than, according to some accounts, half, according to others, 3/4 of what it lost. Therefore the rate of profit hasn't been high enough to stimulate productive investment. Productive investment is the only source of real profits. But if you're a capitalist and you've got the products of previous exploitation, massive surplus value at disposal, you look for somewhere to try and make a profit, you then move into the financial sector. And that effectively is what's happened in each of the bubbles since the early 1980s. And each time you had the growth of economy, you had growth of finance. Finance has certain products. If you have a banker, the banker goes out and buys a cup of coffee. That provides the basis for the growth of the Starbucks in the last 10 or 15 years. You have the growth of all sorts of subordinate industries growing, but the market growth inflating force has been finance, and finance looking towards debt. You can argue that a major source of attempt to make profits out of debt in the 1980s was a look towards third world debt, which collapsed into third world debt crises. You can look at the 1990s when the attempt was made to make profits out of speculation at the stock exchange and speculation of dot-com companies and so on and so forth, which collapsed in 2001 before 9/11. It's quite important to understand that. And you can talk of the last 5 or 6 years in which the driving force was the subprime mortgages and to a less extent other forms of property speculation. That's driven it forward. The reality is a point always is reached in these bubbles in which the question of are the paper profits being made in finance can be translated into real profits. In Marx's term, can these masses of money which have been accumulated by the financial sector be translated into real value which is produced by labour acting on nature? And the situation in each case, at a point is reached where that can't be done and the whole edifice comes tumbling down. And that's what we're witnessing at the moment. We're witnessing at the moment on a scale which states find difficult to deal with. Of course, such is the scale of finance which developed, such has been the interconnectedness of finance between different countries, that crash in one country spreads to another country. Essentially, the big banks in one country have borrowed money from the big banks in other countries, and if they go bust, they pull the other banks down. That's what the whole Lehman Brothers story is about. That's what the whole percolation of this thing across the system. Now, faced with this, people make analogies with the 1930s, and the analogy is well worth making, because you look in terms of it's not been done, I've been reading for the last 3 months, many of the mainstream bourgeois attempts to understand the slump of the 1930s. And what's interesting, they can't. Ben Bernanke, who's meant to be managing this slump, describes the slump of the 1930s as the impossible thing to come to terms with. He describes it as being something every economist tried to understand it, but you can't understand it. There is, however, in the Marxist tradition, a serious attempt to analyse